smaller place if it weren't for the invention of planes. Because of aircraft, journeys that would have taken our ancestors days, weeks, or even months in the case of crossing the oceans, now take just a few hours. You'd have thought that we'd treat planes with respect because of that fact, but they get left behind and abandoned surprisingly often. You're about to see proof of that in this video, which features the most incredible abandoned planes in the world. The airplane graveyard in Bangkok, Thailand, isn't a real graveyard and isn't recognized as such by any local authorities, but it's become the final resting place of more than one derelict aircraft body. In an unlikely twist of fate, though, there are now a whole 3 Thai families living on the planes and using them to make money. The remains of an old Boeing 747, along with 2 MD-82s, can be found close to Ramkhamhaeng Road in the suburbs of the city, discarded on a roadside as if they were everyday waste. It's thought that the aircraft are owned by a local businessman who buys disused planes, strips them of anything that has any value, and throws away the parts he doesn't need. That policy apparently extends to the nose cones and carriages of the planes. The families who live inside them used to be homeless, and say life in an old airplane is a lot more comfortable than life on the street. They even manage to sustain themselves by selling tours of the planes to curious visitors. Nobody knows how long this curious arrangement will last, but the planes have been in situ for a decade now and show no signs of being moved. If you visit the biggest branch of Dunkin' Donuts in Kuta, Indonesia, you'll have a very strange sight to look at out of the window while you're queuing for your donuts. It's a long-forgotten Boeing 737, positioned in such a way that its wing almost touches the store's walls. Nobody appears to know how the plane ended up here. Ngurah Rai International Airport is only a mile away, but the airport authorities say it's nothing to do with them. Some locals say that it was bought by a private owner with the intention of turning it into a restaurant, but the project failed before it could be completed. There's no evidence to support that idea, though, so all anyone knows is that it's been parked here since 2007, and it will probably still be parked here in 2027. The engines of the plane have been stripped out, and the turbines are sealed off, so it's unlikely that anyone would be able to move it again even if they wanted to. The 737 has been standing here for so long that it's become part of the local landscape, and can even be seen on Google Earth. While there are numerous plane wrecks to be found on the surface of the Earth, there are even more to be found underwater. One of the most famous of them is the Corsair, which is a wreck diving site off the coast of Honolulu, Hawaii. The Corsair was on a routine flight in 1948 when its engine spontaneously failed. The experienced pilot managed to safely guide the plane down to land on the water and escaped from the wreck, but the plane didn't manage to float for very long. It sank not long after the pilot was rescued, and despite the fact it was entirely undamaged by the crash, it was decided to leave it where it was at the bottom of the sea. Spending more than 70 years underwater hasn't done the plane many favors, but the eels and stingrays who live in and around it don't seem to mind that it isn't as pretty as it once was. Only the most capable and experienced divers should attempt to visit it in person, though. The Corsair is over 100 feet below the water, and time at the bottom is limited to 15 minutes because of potential health hazards. While it might cross your mind to look underwater for abandoned planes, you probably wouldn't think of looking underground. Even crashed planes don't tend to burrow into the surface of the Earth, so if you ever come across a buried MiG-21, it was probably put there deliberately by British artist Roger Hirons. The eccentric artist buried a MiG-21 in his native East Anglia, England in 2017, and then buried another close to Prague in Czechia the following year after Prague's Rudolfinum Art Gallery heard what he'd done in England and decided that they'd like a buried plane of their own. The official reason for the Prague plane burial was to mark the art gallery's centenary. But when Hirons buried his first plane, he did so as a way of marking the end of the Cold War era that he felt the plane represented. Many people found that to be a strange choice, as the Cold War ended long before 2017, and some military history enthusiasts were less than pleased that he chose to bury such a plane rather than preserve it. Still, that's the thing about art. You can't please everybody. There have been a few pieces of an unidentified plane wedged in a tree in Heritage Park in Mission, British Columbia, Canada, since the early 1970s. Nobody knows who the plane belonged to, how it met its fate, or why nobody came looking for it after it crashed. There are some who say that it's been there for even longer than 50 years. The early 1970s theory comes from the fact that the oldest graffiti on the wreckage is dated to 1971, but it might have been there for several years before someone decided to scrawl their signature on it. Based on what's left of the aircraft, it appears to have been a single-seater plane, but there's not much left of it beyond the cockpit and one wing, so it's hard to say for sure. If whoever was flying the plane when it crashed escaped with their life intact, they were very lucky. We presume that's what happened though, as there have never been any human remains discovered close to the crash site. Given the fact that at least 5 decades have passed since this old plane fell out of the sky, it's unlikely that anybody's going to solve this mystery at this stage. Elsewhere in Canada, you'll find the wreckage of an RCAF DC-3 Dakota in the woods of North York Creek. This is a story that sadly doesn't have a happy ending. The plane came down during bad weather in 1946, striking a mountain on its way down and ending the lives of all 7 people on the aircraft at the time. Pieces of the plane are strewn all over the crash site, but the bulk of it can be seen here on this well-known North York Creek hiking trail. People are welcome to come and see the plane with their own eyes because of the hiking trail, but visitors are asked not to touch or move any of the wreckage. It's considered to be a memorial, so interfering with it would be disrespectful. The biggest piece you'll find is the tail section, which was torn off from the body of the plane at the moment of impact, and so has largely remained in one piece. Time hasn't been kind to the wreck, but there's enough of it left to get an impression of what it must have looked like when it was complete. We've already seen one underwater plane when we took a look at the Corsair earlier on, but that site is very difficult to get to. You'd have a far easier time catching a glimpse of the underwater plane wreck close to Staniel Cay at Roker's Point Settlement in the Bahamas. On most days, you can see it clearly just by looking through the water from above. The plane is barely 6 feet below the water, which might make you wonder why the owners have never retrieved it, but they have no intention of doing so. The old plane has been put in place deliberately, as both an artificial reef and a diving and snorkeling attraction to entertain tourists. Even in waters so shallow, marine life hasn't been put off the idea of setting up home in and around the wreck. Whole schools of tropical fish can be found in almost every crevice, but keep an eye out for the nurse sharks who like to rest underneath its wings. They're mostly docile creatures, but they have been known to bite if accidentally stepped on or poked by passing humans. What more could an old plane hope for than to be retired to a Hall of Fame when its flying career is over? That honor isn't extended to the overwhelming majority of aircraft, but you'll find plenty of them at the Vall Planes of Fame Air Museum in Vall, Arizona, USA. The Planes of Fame Museum, which might be more accurately described as a boneyard, was put together by aviation enthusiast Ed Maloney in 1957 as his way of preserving and honoring the aviation industry. While there are quite a few broken down wrecks at the site, there are also several fully restored vintage planes, some of which date back to the 1930s. Over time, the museum has grown to include other types of memorabilia and exhibits, including old cars and military uniforms. The best of the planes are kept in flying condition and still take to the air every year for special displays. That's no small achievement considering the fact that some of them are 100 years old. In keeping with Maloney's wishes, the museum never turns a plane down. So if you happen to have an old plane you're trying to get rid of, give them a call. Ed Maloney's old museum is impressive, but it's dwarfed by the size of the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group in Tucson, Arizona, USA. The site's name isn't just long, it's also a little inaccurate. There isn't much regeneration or maintenance work being performed on any of the planes you'll find here. Instead, it's the largest military aircraft graveyard on the face of the planet. Here, in this 26,000-acre facility, you'll find at least one unit of every type of plane flown by the military forces of the United States of America since the Second World War. In most cases, there are dozens of units of the same class of plane. The facility hosts a few civilian planes too, Boeing 707s for example. But for the main part, you'll find F-4 bombers, B-29s, and C-74s. While none of the planes will ever fly again, parts from them are taken and used to refurbish active planes that are still part of the military's roster. The U.S. Defense Department's figures suggest that for every dollar spent on keeping the planes here, $11 are saved through the reuse of parts. That must make it one of the most economically efficient graveyards in the world. There's an Ilyushin IL-76 cargo plane standing on the desert in the United Arab Emirates, and although someone must know what it's doing there, nobody appears to want to admit to knowing the full story. However, most people believe that it has something to do with organized crime. The plane, which was built in Uzbekistan during the 1970s, was in service with the military of the Soviet Union until 1990, at which point it was bought by a small aviation company called Air Ses. The owner of Air Ses was the brother of illegal arms dealer Victor Bout, and the government of the UAE strongly suspected that Bout was involved in his brother's business. The company was rarely out of the headlines and was charged with more than 100 breaches of civil aviation law in 1998. That led to the dissolution of the company in 2001, shortly followed by a ban on either of the Bout brothers entering the UAE. Because of the ban, the brothers can't come and pick up their plane. That technically makes the forgotten aircraft the property of the government, but they don't appear to have much interest in trying to salvage a 50-year-old plane, and so it's likely to stay here until someone comes up with a better idea. There would already be something sinister and foreboding-looking about Sólheimasandur Beach in Iceland, even if there wasn't a plane wreck on it. The weather is cold, and is black, and the sky always seems to be gray. If anything, the shattered remains of the U.S. Navy DC-3 on the beach are just doing their best to fit in with the general theme. The huge plane crash-landed on the beach in 1973, thankfully without anybody aboard suffering lasting damage. That didn't stop the pilot from catching the blame for the incident, though, as it appeared he'd allowed his plane to run out of fuel. The plane was already on the verge of retirement when it went down, so rather than a salvage attempt being mounted, it was immediately written off and abandoned. It's said to have spent most of the next 2 decades in one piece, until a local farmer came along one day in the 1990s, cut out the entire tail section, and either sold it or used it for scrap metal. Surprisingly, though, the engines are still attached, and the cabin is still pretty much the way it was when the crew walked away almost 50 years ago. A plane that's abandoned in a remote location will probably be left to rot in place. A plane that's been left behind somewhere that's easy to reach, though, will almost certainly find itself repeatedly targeted by vandals and graffiti artists. That's what happened to this twin-turboprop Grumman G159 in Cartersville, Georgia, USA, which now boasts a psychedelic external color scheme. The plane was abandoned in mysterious circumstances by the side of a river during the early 2000s. It didn't take long for scavengers to find it, and they picked clean its instrument panels, engines, wiring, tail, and even the wings in next to no time at all. They left behind the rest of the fuselage, though, including the leather seats. The plane once belonged to Phoenix Air, who operate in the area but say that this Grumman was sold into private hands after they stopped using it, and they're not responsible for its fate. The land the plane is standing on belongs to the city of Cartersville, and so the local authorities could have it removed if they wanted to, but they've decided to let it lie and continue in its role as an unconventional tourist attraction instead.